So I just start with a story. There's so many stories. We have lots of different native bees. You have the honeybee, which has its own beekeeping societies, one in every county almost in Maryland. And that level of detail of natural history for the honeybee is mirrored in all of the individual species, about 450 that occur in Maryland, except we don't know what they are, right? So that's going to be a repeated theme. So here's an example. Last year, I went to an area at the edge of Patuxent Wildlife Research Refuge where I had in the past found some interesting plants, and it's always a plant-based thing with bees. So in particular, I was interested in looking at some of the ericaceous shrubs. So Lyonia in particular had struck in my mind because there was a lot there. And I went there because I knew that there are some bees that only go to Lyonia. So the way things work is that bees, native bees, are often pollen specialists. So it's not just a hodgepodge, any old flower, fine, feed my babies some pollen and nectar from whatever's available. It's super specific. And it's very much related to native plants. And we might dial back to what's going on with non-native plants and how do they support or not really support our native bee fauna. But in this case, I knew that there were bees that liked Lyonia. And so I went there and I collected a set of bees, not too many. Wasn't much bee action. One of them was Khalidi's Preductus. This is a picture of Khalidi's Preductus, kind of a bland bee in terms of its looks, nothing spectacular. And it turns out it was the first record for the state of Maryland. So very cool. And one would ask, well, all right, well, has it just moved into the state? Has it, declined? Is it rare? All those kinds of things. It's basically rarely caught. Is it really rare? Well, how many people look at on Lyonia plants for anything really? And how many patches of Lyonia are there? They only bloom for a short period of time. This bee, like many of the specialist bees, are out only when its particular flower is blooming, in this case, Lyonia, and then it's gone the rest of the year because what it does is gather, in this case, Lyonia pollen, mixes it with Lyonia or other nectars. Their nectars are usually not so specific. Makes a nest in the ground in this case, and packs it full of the mix of pollen and nectar, lays an egg, seals it off, does that, maybe 8 times. It's about the average. And then that's it. The female dies, the male died a long time ago, and the young stay underground until the following year when they emerge as adults to start the cycle again when the Lyonia theoretically is blooming. So here's the problem, okay, this has only been recorded one time. Where do we put that in rarity? Do we say, oh my God, it's so incredibly rare, there's only one record for Maryland, maybe we should put it on a list and set up a whole routine for protecting it? You'll see several more stories like this. It probably is okay. There are just so few people looking for native bees. This is a big problem. We just don't know a lot. So Lyonia, and quite a nice plant. So some of the things that we would like to do, and we have lists of specialist bees, is encourage people to plant plants that are supportive of specialist bees. In other words, no Lyonia, no Khalidi Preductus, and 2 or 3 other species, including things like Melita melitoides. So, these are all scientific names. They don't mean much, but this plant and biodiversity in general, plant biodiversity, is really the driver in the conservation, the rarity, and the distribution of bees in the state. So here's some figures, roughly 450 species. We add a few each year. Basically we look in different places and we check out different plants as we happen to be around. Many, many, many kinds of plants, many, many parts of the state need tons of investigation. So of this 445, we found, so that includes everything from the past and other people's collections, not just ours. Our lab has collected 367 species. And we have collected about 150,000 records in the state of Maryland. This is, again, just our lab. And that sounds like, oh my God, you're killing more bees. You're the problem. Well, here's just a couple of figures. One is a average hive of honeybees produces about 250,000 bees individuals across a year. So that's actually, we haven't even collected one beehive's worth of specimens, which also indicates how little we know, right? So we've collected just this tiny fraction. If we do our little estimation on the back of envelopes, we come up with that on average, about 25,000, 26,000 bees are produced per acre per year in Maryland. So again, if you calculate that out, I haven't done that, that is trillions of bees. So there are a lot of bees. We're just looking at a tiny bit of those. No wonder we don't know or don't feel like we know that much. And it's hard for us to really call out the conservation problems, but I will, because there are some patterns that need to be addressed. So here's a county list. I don't know if people saw the link that Lily put out of a link to the spreadsheet that has all the bees listed for each county. And you can also see that pretty up to date on Maryland Biodiversity's lovely website if you were interested in that. And just FYI, if you really are interested in bees, we can send you tons of other information. A lot of it is technical. And because you're in state, you can also visit the bee lab and volunteer there and help with bee surveys and all the stuff we're doing with plants, which is a conservation angle that I'm pushing for people to, make action on. So you can take a look here. You can see that the place with the least is Baltimore City. No big surprise, but we could really bump up those numbers if we looked again in some of the park areas. And the place with the most species here is PG County. Why is that? I live in PG County. I work in PG County. That is the only reason. So again, pointing out that our information is low. Compare that to, say, birds or herps or some of the other vertebrate groups in terms of what we know about where things are and their commonness. Okay, if we look at questions of non-native species, which is always a hot topic, we have a bunch. So here are roughly 20 species, I think. Did I say that? Yeah, about 4% of the total number. So that's not big. In a lot of other insect groups, it's way higher, 50%, ladybugs almost entirely, and introduced fauna. These are names that you don't really know, but one thing to point out is that the names in red have only been discovered after 1980. Okay, so what we're seeing is an increased introduction of new species, invasive species, largely due to the shipping industry, which is schlepping over all kinds of materials that now get here efficiently and rapidly, are shrink wrapped in large pallets. The pallets are invaded by all kinds of insects and they just come out. Most of them die, but all it takes is a few, and those areas where they come out, like the harbor and warehouse districts surrounded by non-native weedy species, they love it. So we could, again, talk about all kinds of really cool stories for each of these non-native species. In terms of a threat to our native species, the big one is honeybees. And the reason for that is honeybees are subsidized. They are super efficient. They're wonderful, interesting animals. And their role in Maryland as pollinators is basically nil. They do pollinate things, but in terms of necessary pollination, they're really not providing anything that the native species can't do. So even in the commercial operations, with maybe a couple exceptions like pickle fields and a couple other places that are really tough in terms of pollinating, most of the orchards and things like that do not need honeybees, but they're super competitors. So wherever you have honeybees, they're in competition with all the native species in the area. And so we gently try to discourage people from keeping honeybees in the sort of general category of like, well, I just gotta, I hear this fairly regularly. Well, hey, Sam, I'm helping out bees. I paid someone to put honeybees in my backyard. Okay, that that helped them with some money, but you think you might be doing the world a favor, but you're not. You're actually doing the world a disfavor for bringing those in. On the other hand, if you are a lover of honeybees and honey that you make yourself and you just think they're cool and that's your passion, go for it. But um, don't be an advocate for putting a lot of hives on the ground, because you don't do the honeybees a favor, who have a whole series of problems with diseases, and you are just creating all kinds of competitive problems for the rest of the bees. And the plant world does not need honeybees, particularly the native plant world.
Sam, could you send me a list of these non-native bees, which should be considered for the Maryland Invasive Species Council as being,
Yeah, just remind me. I mean, I just send
if
you.
you'll send that to me, that would be great.
Okay. So here's a list of sort of the dirt ball species in Maryland. Again, really hard to wrap your head around. Honeybees are the number 10 in there. These are a wide variety of different species, but a lot of them are open country kinds of things. And a lot of these are species that would be called generalists. In other words, are not specialized on a single plant, are out all year, are semi-colonial. I won't get into a lot of definitions here, but they can make it in a disturbed environment. And most of the state is some kind of disturbed environment. So that's what you're looking at from a native plant point of view. Now, if we take all the species that we know about and we come up with some idea about how common or how not common they are. So 22 of those have some taxonomic issues or other kinds of things where it's just a little fuzzy. So we're not going to even bother considering them. And then roughly half the species are in some kind of abundant, common, regular status. And again, this is sort of just a feel based on our collecting and being out a lot. We have a bunch of species, though, another half, a little less than half, are in the uncommon to rare, and 3 are possibly extirpated. But I say possibly because how do we know, right? We don't get out that much. And what we found, as you'll see, that if you look, you can find almost all of these things. To illustrate some of the issues here, here's number of records in our bee database. And we are looking at a few, so what we are is counts of individuals, okay? And this is the number of species that fall into those counts. So a few species are really abundant way out here. You can see that there's almost very few species are super abundant. And then as you come close to zero, a whole bunch of them are just onesie twosie kinds of things. And in fact, if we go and we remember we have about a database of 360 some species, well, 49 of them have only one record in that database. Okay, so that should raise some alarms, or just a notion of undersampling if almost 50 species have only been recorded once. It doesn't mean that, so the interpretation is not that, oh, that species flew in from somewhere else and just landed there and was only briefly here in the state, like say some rare bird that crossed the Atlantic or something. No, it just means that we're doing a crappy job, because almost all of those species that occurred once had to have had a long lineage of other predecessors and other generations who produced subsequent generations. So they're almost all around. We're just not finding them. And then you can go on from, we split in half almost every single time. 2 records for a specimen, 24 species, 3 records, 19, 4 records, 11. So again, a modeling of a bad job. Okay, another story. Here's a cool little bee, Dynomia Navadensis. It happens to have been found near my house, because I do a lot of stuff just for fun, in an old, actually still active gravel pit. And I had permission to, look for bees in there. Sand areas are often places of rare plants and cool bees. So it was 2 miles from my house, maybe. And this bee, though, what I found was its nearest record was in North Carolina. And I'm like, oh my God, this has to have been something that just flew in, and it's a one-off. And then a couple years later, a couple other guys, Tim and Don, went to the same area, but on the opposite side of the gravel pit, and found an entire colony of these things. So these are the kinds of things that repeat over and over. You're not in the right place at the right time, in the right location, the right circumstances. That bee might as well not exist. And we just aren't looking hard enough. Just like if we only had one bird watcher in the whole state, what would we be able to say about birds? So I'm guessing there's another 50 species in the state, in the region, that probably are in the state that we just haven't found at all. You can kind of do the math and predict that. If you have 49 that were only seen once, there's a whole bunch that have only been seen 0 times that you just haven't detected yet. So a lot more to do. Another story, here's Poplar Island. Oh, you can't really see Poplar Island on this picture, but this is a survey of Poplar Island. Poplar Island, for those of you who don't know, is a dread spoil spot. There used to be an island there. It decreased to about an acre with a little bit of scrub, but that's it. It's certainly not supporting much of anything in terms of bees. And then they bumped it out to, let's say, 200 acres, I don't really know, and made big, gigantic dikes and pumped it full of Baltimore Harbor in the bottom, which actually is relatively clean. Once you get down, way down there, you're out of the Curtis Bay sludge pits. The main harbor is pretty clean stuff. So they need a place to put it. They put it there, creating all kinds of habitat, but not really for bees. It wasn't their goal. Someone went out and started doing a survey, did a year-long survey, 6 different sites, and they came up with 100 species of bees. So those bees, and 2 of these, actually several, but here's 2 I'm illustrating, had never been seen in the state before. Yet, interestingly, Poplar Island is 2 miles from the nearest landfall, which is in Talbot County. So here we have a couple interesting things. You build it, they will come. They can fly over long distances. They're great dispersers, right? If they come out of the ground, they don't find whatever their food source is nearby, they just keep flying. And so they have to fly to find these specialized things, and then they stop, and then those populations can build up. And so they find things like these islands. So that's really good news. But again, pointing out like, oh, well, we have found bees out there we had never seen before. They have to be in Maryland too. We're just, again, overlooking a whole lot of things. Here's an example of one of the most common, maybe the most common in the state, 22,000 records of Algochlorella aurata. This bright green bee, it's in everyone's backyard. You can look on your flowers and see these little tiny bright green bees if you look closely enough. Here was another analysis we did. So an issue is that we don't have any monitoring programs for bees, really. When we talk about bee decline, it's mostly a vacuous statement if you're looking at it from a data point of view. But what can we do? What can we do when we look at this? So we have a list of species, and a lot of this information comes from over 100 years ago when they had the first people who were working on taxonomic issues having to do with bees. So 100 years ago, they did a lot of work, and throughout the US, and then it dwindled, and now people are interested again, but they mostly are looking at ecological relationships. They're not hunting bees like the old timers did. So we asked the handful of active people east of the Mississippi. Here's a list of all the species east of the Mississippi. Go through them and tick off all the ones that you have seen. And then we iterated that until we came down with 37 species that had not been seen in the last 20 years. So this is that list. And a characteristic, so this is all throughout the East, not just Maryland. The characteristic here, rare, super rare. A lot of these, even at the global level, were described for 1 or 2 species. And some of these may actually even be bogus. In other words, it may be a taxonomic mix-up by the person who authored the species name. But others are certainly legitimate species, just no one had seen them in the last 20 years. But they were all rare. That's the point. It's not like, oh my God, we had all these common species, now we can't find them. So that would be a crisis of the capital K level. This is just like a mystery, Then, so that was published in 2010, I think. And since that time, about half of the species on this list have been found just by people continuing to do bee work. And so they weren't really missing. They were just AWOL from being found because people weren't looking in the right place in the right time. Deep South, for example, is a place that people don't spend much time. A bunch of these are southern species. Okay, a couple of habitats in Maryland that are really loaded with interesting things. One is any sand habitat. And it turns out that you can just look at sand mines. Where are the sand mines? A big chunk of sand mines are along the Patuxent River on the Anne Arundel side, which was the windward side of the Patuxent River, because the prevailing winds cross the Patuxent at right angles, blow the sand on one side, gravel on the other. Cool, weird little sand duney almost habitats. And it turns out we have a paper that people could look at. But over the millennia, that was almost always open land. It was burned, it was grazed. The Indians kept that all open. The colonists kept it all open. Prior to that, it was just dry, dry, dry. And it developed a little prairie-esque kind of habitats, and a lot of open sand species existed in there. And so Jug Bay in particular so there's some residues of this. Mostly we don't see it because we let all the woods grow back in and we don't burn anything or disturb anything in lots of ways. And that's a key missing component sometimes. Here's Jug Bay Wetlands Reserve. Here is an old sand mine. You can see a little bit opening there. And here is a old horse field. And these are kind of semi-open sorts of spots. The short story here is that people do look in this area. They allow collecting of bees and they encourage it and other insects. And a long time ago, Ben Hollister, working with me, collected some bees. We identified them. We had some Aepilus specimens, and I keyed them out and said they were Aepilus howardi. A guy a few years ago, Tom Ornifurco from Canada, was revising the genus Aepilus and said, which is not a super common genus. He said, "Hey, Sam, can you send me up anything that you have on with that genus?" And I said, "Sure." And so I sent him up a bunch of Aepilus that I had, including these two. And long story short, he said, "You know what? These are not Aepilus howardi. These are new species." And he gave them a name, Aepilus andrii, which I think is his dad's name. And so the other interesting thing is, it was a male and female, so that's good. Those are the only ones known in the entire world. So right there at Jug Bay, we have two species. If Ben Hollister had decided, I don't really feel like putting out those bull traps or whatever, we would not know that they even existed. Other species, Perdita bradleyi, Secotes brachycephalus, have been found also at Jug Bay in the same sand habitats. They require open sand to do their nests, and there's probably some species, again, who knows which ones, that they're in. So Jug Bay, very cool. There's other really cool places. No one's looking. So I mentioned the specialist bees thing here, and you can look up jaredfowler.com online and pretty easily find this. He's done it for the entire US, maybe Canada too. And he's just documented what little we know about which bees are associated with which sets of flowers at the family level and below. So some species, it's one species of plant, one species of bee. In others, it's like, it's probably on it's a Pachyra specialist, and that's all we know. We don't know which Pachyra. And Pachyra is an interesting one. We've been working on that a little bit. So some Pachyra species, this is golden ragwort, seem to be very attractive to bees. Others have zero attraction, and some seem to have specialists and others seem not. So even at that genus level, there's a lot of complexity. And again, pointing to harboring biodiversity of plants is going to automatically harbor biodiversity of bees, even though you don't know that, right? We know way more about plants than we do about bees. So you want to do conservation actions, it's planting flowering plants of a wide variety of type, focusing on the groups that are documented here in terms of the plant group species, and they're not usually very uncommon plants, right? Vacciniums, sunflowers, perennial sunflowers, those kinds of things. But a lot of them have dialed out. When's the last time you saw Lyonia? It's around. It's not a commonly planted. You can't find it in the, homestead gardens or something, but it's around. So we should be working with different groups to begin planting some of these less common things that are supporting the rare bees, even if we're not actually looking at the rare bees that come to them. And they do. We have lots of stories of like some of these kinds of plants being planted in the middle of Washington, D.C., and then boom, there's that weird little bee showing up. Here is a Ragwort story. So here is a super secret, apparently, site, DOD site, Pomonkey, Charles County. They invited me to come down and help their pollinator planting stuff. This is the main campus of super secret things. This is theirs too over here, just an open field. I said, why do you guys mow that field all the time? Because we always have mowed that field. Let's do it once a year. Immediately success pollinator wise. This was scrubby, had a bunch of ragwort in it. It had a lot of action. I collected bees. I said, oh, I think that might be Andrina gardneri, a ragwort specialist that hadn't been recorded outside of Garrett County before, at least recently. And then I looked around and there were some of these parasitic bees, Nomadis Seneciophila, it turns out. And I said, those look different. This is one of my groups, so I'm like, those don't look right. And but had to take them back to the lab, look under the microscope, and as a taxonomy-oriented biologist, like this is really cool. This bee was on that list, things that had not been seen in the past, 20 years. So check that off. So that was cool. A male and a female, that's cool. We always like that. And then I realized, oh, we didn't know anything about this bee. So here's a little backstory. Seneciophila, lover of Senecio. Senecio, the old name for golden ragwort, which is now in the genus Pachyra. Is your head spinning on too much detail? And this bee was collected on Senecio. This bee is almost certainly a nest parasite of Andrina gardneri, and we didn't know that. So anyway, there's those kinds of discoveries. You don't need to go to freaking Madagascar to find new cool things. It's right in your backyard, but we're not doing it. Another example, if you ever get a chance to go to Mount Cuba in northern Delaware, do it. It is just this fantastic area of native wildflower research and gardens. Matt Sarver, a buddy of mine who knows bees, went there and collected a bunch of bees off of these flowers, looking at the list of specialist bees that we had generated and particularly targeted some of these things. And he found a whole list of bees that had never been seen in Delaware before, including things like Andrina pulmonii, which is not on Greek vervain, it's Greek valerian, which is pulmonium, and which is a lovely plant. You should plant that one in your yard. And the nearest record was the border of Ohio and West Virginia for this species. But again, almost certainly there are a whole series of populations between Delaware and Ohio. It didn't fly in from freaking Ohio. It just wasn't found. Things from bellworts, shrubby dogwoods, rhododendrons, beard's tongue, pickleweed, and wild beans. Those are all new plants. No records of bees. They've been there the whole time. We're not looking. But you have to also ask, where are those plants? One of the reasons they're not found is those plants are not that common because we have not given those plants a place to grow very often. We don't have these wild areas, these semi-wild areas, particularly wild areas that have elements of disturbance and turnover and have large enough landscapes to allow the rototilling of species back and forth. We tend to lose species, plant species over time, because we're a little too neat and tidy, and everything has to be a tree or a forest or a lawn. So we need these more dynamism, more plant species. Astig Island, here's another example of where we have a bunch of endemic species only on that island, or with a few cases where they might be just off island, probably because they need the dunes, and probably because they also have some plants out there on the dunes that they use. So we have Astig Island as a, vulnerable to sea level rise and climate change kind of place with its own set of bees. Who knew? So this is probably too much detail for you guys, but there are lots in Maryland. If you're going to talk about rare and uncommon and declining species, there's a lot of issues that just need to be cleaned up taxonomically. So there's new species, there's fuzzy areas, and identification problems galore to work on for any of you who want to do that. This is just showing some of how I calculated how many bees there were per acre, which we can dispense with as too much detail. This is my account information. So we give a lot of these little stories and vignettes, and we have a whole collection catalog of over 5,000 super high resolution pictures, which are completely public domain. So public domain that we don't even want you to ask our permission, because it's a waste of our time, because we're just going to say always yes. You can sell them, modify them, use them in your talks, posters, all that kind of good stuff. We put up our new ones and some of our old ones and tell stories about them on our public media, our social media sites, particularly Instagram. But we also have a Facebook group that at USGS is sort of, I don't know what they call it, our handle maybe. And so you can find us in lots of places. The bottom URL is a little field guide. If you have a pair of butterfly binoculars or something like that, you can actually identify in the field to the genera level a bunch of bee species. So get people a little more engaged. To get it to the species level rather than to the genus level, different story, microscope work. If you're interested in that, I can send you lots of links, including links to our ongoing ID classes. And I'll point out one thing. So I said several times, we don't really know much about the status of bees. Like we don't have a monitoring program. We don't have enough people, blah, blah, blah. But I can tell you with absolute confidence that there has been big bee declines, even though I poo-poo that when people start casually talking about bee decline because they don't really know what they're talking about. So for example, look at where I am. I'm in a house. You're probably in a house. You probably have a road to your house. You probably have lawn. You probably have, there's a paved road somewhere nearby. There's a school nearby. You probably go to a business, or maybe used to go to a business who would go in all these places. Guess what? There are no bees there, right? There's no bees where your house is because you have a house on it. And there's no bees on a paved road because what can live on a paved road? But there used to be. And so if we do those calculations and we look at all the landscapes, all the features in a landscape that have either completely eliminated the possibility of bees nesting and the plants that support them really too, and the places that we have greatly dumbed down, let's call that roadsides, row crops, farms, pastures, playgrounds. There's still bees on some of those, but they are basically the crow and sparrow bees. Anything that's going on there is doing fine. That leaves a bunch of edge habitats and conservation areas as our core, and everything else has taken it on the chin. What can we do to reverse that? Well, the big thing is planting back. You need to repatriate your lawns because I'm just going to sound super negative here. You are the problem, right? Your yard, you might not have scraped it personally, but someone did. You're living in it. You can change that by just simply planting a bunch of native plants in there and shifting things around. You can do it very aesthetically and beautifully too, but that's a contribution. We're not introducing bison and wolves back into Tacoma Park, but you can reintroduce and support a lot of these uncommon declining native bee species by choosing the right suite of native plants and encouraging parks, municipalities, other people to do similar things and make up for like your past sins. Now I'm sounding like a preacher. Okay, I'm stopping there and we can go right into questions.
Well, Sam, while we're waiting for people to either write in or unmute themselves to ask their questions, there have been, Mark had a couple of questions.
Mhm.
Are bee taxonomists splitters or lumpers?
Right now, there's probably more splitting going on. And the reason is we have molecular techniques. So in the past, people tend to call things subspecies, and it turns out a lot of the subspecies that were identified were actually species. There's a lot that hasn't been done that much. There's tons and tons of species groups that still need to have their DNA checked under check under the hood for the DNA.
Okay, and you mentioned mowing at that place.
Can I mention on the splitter lumper, one way to solve that problem when there's a big debate is to use trinomials. That's a tool that can be used.
Yeah, they do that, but I'm just saying that right now, a lot of those trinomials are becoming separate species. Lily, did you have a question?
I'm just reading questions from the chat. Mark also asked, mow once a year at what height and which month?
Yeah, so in general, mow late in the winter. If you're in a big property owner, then you might have problems getting your equipment into some of these areas because that's the mushy season. You could do it in early winter, but then, a lot of birds and other animals are using the seeds that were produced by the plants that you planted that were supporting the bees during the summer. In general, something like a brush hog type of height of 6 to 8 inches, totally good.
Okay. Bonnie asked, Sam, did you say you found a rare bee in Charles County? Where in Pamunkey? We have a major airport expansion proposed in Pamunkey. Charles County wants to remove almost 600 acres of the watershed conservation district, which is the environmental regulation that's holding back the expansion.
Yeah, so the rare bee that I found was that Nomadis Seneciophila and Endangered gardneri. I haven't spent that much time in Charles County. I'm sure it is rich in uncommon bee species if someone were to actually look, and we could direct them where to look. So that site where I was talking about is a DoD site. I can't remember, Pamunkey's not that big of a place. If you look on a map for a Department of Defense installation with a couple big radar dome things, that's it.
I know where that is. Thank you. I just wondered how close it was to the biological hotspot where they want to put in an impervious surface bomb.
Oh, yeah, I have no idea.
No, I do. I just
Okay.
hear what I know where the site is that has.
Yeah.
Chuck asked, what is it about sandy places that draws bees, and how useful are carpenter bees? Is there a way to draw them away from homes without killing them?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Sand, it appears that some bees actually require sand, particularly deep sand, to make a nest, although that's speculation. It's just based on distributions. We know that they're always associated with sand. And it may also be paired with specialization on plants that like those same sand habitats, but again, not super clear, but it's something about sand and open sand, not sand under a bunch of old trees or that kind of thing. So these are areas that need disturbance to maintain these bee populations. Carpenter bees, it's on you, man. You have wood, they're going to have carpenter bees, and you have cedar siding. They love that. The basic problem is that they actually are, it takes decades and decades before they create any kind of structural issue. But the problem is at some point in your wood, cedar siding is being a classic, at some point woodpeckers figure out that just below the wood surface is all these yummy things, and they'll just drill that out and it looks terrible. they don't, the males don't sing. That's the one that people see because they hover around, have a white face. Females, very workwoman-like. They just go to the nest and leave. They don't defend their nest. They essentially don't sting. Like even if you catch them in their hand, which I've done accidentally, you might get poked, but it is so minor that like, did I get stung by that carpenter bee? That's the level. They're going on a mimicry thing. They're mimicking bumblebees, which do have a, definite, bite to their sting. So they just look like bumblebees, so birds and other things ignore them. So why bother developing all kinds of expensive venom? Just skip that.